Hello.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you too. How are you?
I am too busy. This is not a comment on right now. It's just generally, I've taken on a new position. I'm currently chair of the Women Faculty Forum, which is like a cross-school thing. It doesn't pay anything. It's not. And it's a lot of work. Even though it's the summer, it's a lot of work.
Well, sounds like a fun position, even if it doesn't pay.
It's a really nice, it's a really great advocacy position for equity and diversity, and these are things that I believe in, and I would still prefer to be, you know, an onlooker rather than the
Yeah.
the head. But it comes to all of us, is all I can tell you. So,
Yeah. No, I'm really enjoying being an editor for the Yale Historical Review, but that doesn't pay either. But
hmm
I'm okay with that. Gives me
hmm
something to do in quarantine, so
hmm
no complaints.
and where are you in quarantine?
I am on Little Deer Isle in Maine right now in this cabin
No
that my parents have.
way. Okay, so oh my God. So you're not going to get any sympathy from me whatsoever.
I should
Oh,
not.
that's
Yeah, no, it's
fantastic.
good.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that sounds so good. All right. So I'm not really sure how I can help you, but you ask me questions and I'll try to answer them.
Cool. So I'll just give you a bit of background on what we're doing. The scope is pretty broad for the project we're working on, but basically the Yale Historical Review is involved in a few different things right now. And one of them is the creation of a new website. And we're going to have a section on it for the current times, which are historical like talks about or concerning different aspects of coronavirus. So I thought it would be really interesting to talk to you about the history of homeopathic medicine, how that's influenced the current anti-vax, like anti-max trends, or if they're even correlated at all in the first place. Um, so yeah, that's
Okay.
basically where I'm at.
You should also know that just a couple of days ago, I was interviewed by Alex McCraven, who's writing on what did we talk about? Race and health disparities, I guess. She was a student in my, she's another editor of yours. She was a student in my Women in Medicine seminar a couple of years ago. Um, so it's interesting that you should say COVID and homeopathy because, so can I just like get started and you can,
Absolutely.
you can turn me as you want and you can say, okay, but I really want to know about, or, whatever. But one of the reasons that homeopathy actually became widely known and widely popular in the United States was the result of a really scary epidemic in 1832, called the big time cholera epidemic. And that was a pandemic, actually, cholera. And really, well, in fact, it's still true today. There's actually nothing you can do for people with cholera other than to just to hydrate them, pretty much. So people were also at a loss in 1832. And many regular or orthodox doctors, I think I like the term regular, that I'll tell you what term they liked, which was doctor, right? They liked to be called doctor and everybody else was like quacks or something, but let's just call them regular doctors. This was still an era where people used a lot of bloodletting, which is a really, really bad idea for cholera. Like, you know, um, and really most of their depletive therapies drained the body that was already drained, right? So you already have a very vulnerable body, and people were dying anyway. And homeopathy is a much different kind of therapeutic system. It rejects bloodletting. It rejects most depletive therapies. It believes in very small doses. I don't know how much I have to tell you about homeopathy. And they did really well. Their patients did really well. I don't mean that nobody died, but like comparatively, it was amazing. And people started to say, oh my God, homeopaths know how to deal with cholera. Maybe they know how to deal with other things as well. So it was just this amazing moment. And in fact, I know, because I've read some of them, a number of regular physicians who were incredibly frustrated with how badly their training had left them in terms of dealing with cholera, quit and converted and became homeopaths and wrote about it.
So are you saying that it was specifically cholera and that the treatments that regular doctors used were ineffective because bloodletting is so bad against cholera? Or was it more that, and therefore there needed to be an alternative? Or was it more that homeopathy just had a system that was looked at more the patient themselves rather than like the symptoms, and people liked that when neither treatment was really doing much anyways?
Well, I mean, I have to say that if you read the sources from the cholera epidemics of 1832 and 1847, it does look like what homeopaths were doing worked pretty well. Okay, I don't want to get into a major philosophical discussion about efficacy. We can talk about that if that's what you want. But so I don't know that I would want to argue that everybody didn't know anything and therefore they just picked one up over the other or something like that. And certainly homeopaths would have been outraged to think that they didn't know anything. They were usually very well-read people, actually. But it is true that homeopathy portrayed itself, and I think this is true also, as a more whole patient kind of medicine. It took much longer with patients, right? They didn't come in and say, you got this, you got to do this, and then they went on, right? And they were especially careful with drugs, like really, really careful, meticulous. They didn't just sort of, say, well, mix those two and see how it goes, which is never a good thing at any time in history. And there were times, this is part of a homeopathic tradition, where some physicians would test drugs on themselves. So talk about, putting your body where your mouth is, right? They would say, I tried this out, or my family used this or something. I mean, that's, you just never heard a regular doctor say, well, my wife, or like, no, never, and often, I won't say always, but often they were somewhat less elitist. They didn't throw around Latin names of diseases just because they could, So there was a style that was a bit different. They weren't populist healers. There were populist healers at that time. Okay, so I want to make sure that you think of homeopaths as sort of in the middle, not like people's doctors, right? They were those two. So my first sense is actually that certain kinds of pandemics were very good for homeopathy. Like, did a lot of good for American homeopathy. And they got a lot of converts, they got a lot of doctors, regular doctors who became homeopaths, and they got a lot of patients. And plus, there was just something about the fact that homeopaths had such different statistics, clinical results, that everybody wanted to understand that. So don't think that people only started to count in like 1900. Like, people counted, right? They were really, this wasn't just, my neighbor down the street. This is, I had X number of patients and this happened to X number of them and so on. And, it's an interesting moment.
So it seems like the focus of homeopathic medicine was very much on the individual, not only the person that they're being treated, but also just in terms of anecdotal evidence for the treatment of different methods, like as you said, that homeopaths were more likely to try out drugs on like themselves or someone they knew, and then cite that as being
Oh,
useful. Do you think they were more likely to do that?
I'm not giving you enough homeopathic background. Homeopathy was a very intensely philosophical system, and it was based on the writings of an Austrian doctor, Samuel Hahnemann, and in fact there were homeopathic schools and hospitals named after him all around the country called Hahnemann Hospital. And he didn't come to the States, right? He stayed in Europe, but he wrote numbers of books and treatises that were studied and developed. Okay, they weren't the only thing that you studied, but they were sort of like the heart and soul of homeopathy. So that there were systems and theories that explained not only to homeopaths themselves, but that homeopaths sought to explain to patients also. You know, I can tell you why this is working. I can tell you why this regular drug isn't, you know. So I just want to add that, right? It's not that they said, I tested it and hey, that was an N of 1 or something. There was a theory behind it also.
Gotcha. Yeah, I read your article on the Hahnemann Medical College for the proper place of homeopathy, and it was really interesting because when I hear the word homeopathy, like now, or like, you know, before I read the article, before this conversation, etc., I always associate it with like movements that are sort of, I guess, what's the word, like anti-system, like anti-mainstream medicine, such that it seems to me more founded on mistrust for the larger system rather than its own like system of actual ideas to back it up. But that definitely doesn't seem to be the case back in the day.
Right. I'm talking about how it began.
Yeah.
Right. And homeopathy has gone through lots of different phases over the past 200 years or so. And you have homeopathy taken up by kind of assorted anti-establishment groups, including anti-vaxxers, absolutely, including sort of kind of new age naturopath type people who will say, well, I practice a little of this and a little homeopathy and a little something or other. Okay, in the 19th century, there was no such thing as a little homeopathy, right? Either you were a homeopath, right, or you did something else. There actually was a group of people who prided themselves on taking, as they said, the best of everything, and they were called eclectics with a capital E, like a medical group called eclectics. And they were pretty influential in the late 19th century, but then they sort of died away. So, okay, there was one group that did take a little homeopathy, but that kind of association with slightly weird anti-establishment people, mostly not so much. Also, homeopaths in the 19th century, for example, really believed in vaccination. Not only did they believe in vaccination, they believed that vaccination worked because it was homeopathic. You take the very tiniest, small amount and you give it to someone, and you know what? They are protected, right? That's so homeopathic.
That's
so no, they were very pro-vax. Yes. So a lot has changed. One of the things that happened by the 1920s or 30s is that homeopathy became a very, very, very small sort of system with very, very few MDs practicing it. And however, it was sort of continued by a group of lay, mostly women, not just patients, but also sort of advocates. And they were very much part of a kind of broader movement that was critical of the AMA, for example, for its conservative politics. They were critical of consumer culture sometimes. Like, they were critical of a whole bunch of things. And homeopathy sort of, in their mind, kind of fit into that. And elements of that have continued into the 21st century, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, like, if you look at homeopathy as like a sort of, or as you're talking about that trend where it's sort of going against like a lot of the current practices in our country, then I think it makes a lot of sense to have like allopathic movements now, in the sense that, or sorry, homeopathic movements now, in the sense that our medical system right now is just terrible with how much drugs cost and how hard it is to become a doctor and how hard it is to see a good doctor. It makes sense to want to rebel against that and say, well, you don't actually need this training to be able to treat anyone, and you don't need to pay like $800 every time you want to take a drug.
Right.
So, like, on that level, I think that the homeopathic movement makes a lot of sense. But I get the impression that a lot of people invoke homeopathy to justify like stances that are purely anti-establishment.
I
Or
think
I mean,
that's
maybe not.
really true. For example, homeopathy was never, until maybe the late 20th century, anti-drug. Never. There were homeopathic pharmaceutical companies. There still are homeopathic pharmaceutical companies in India and France that produce homeopathic drugs, right? I'm sorry, that's an industry, like, pharma, right? It's like medium pharma, not big pharma, but medium pharma, right? And and the idea is that to be a good homeopath, either a practitioner or a patient, you should buy the purest homeopathic drugs, right? You don't just buy something that someone says, it's sort of homeopathic, isn't it? Or something. You buy something that appears to be homeopathically tested and assured. So it's interesting that at least there is this very strong tradition that's very much not anti-pharma, right? Anti-regular pharma, but not the other pharma, right? And yet homeopathy also works for people who don't ever want to buy drugs over the counter, who want to develop them themselves, right? And you can do that with an enormous amount of work, but you can do that. And a lot of homeopathic drugs in the 19th century, with the very beginnings of a pharmaceutical industry, were drugs that people made themselves, just like regular doctors do. Where do you think regular doctors got most of their drugs? Not all. You could get some from Europe, right? Or buy some ingredients from like Africa or the Caribbean or something like that. But mostly, you fixed it yourself. And homeopaths did too.
Yeah. The section on how homeopaths don't want to mix drugs in the Hahnemann School of Medicine, I thought that was really interesting to me. Or it was really interesting to me. Could you like describe why they didn't want to mix drugs and only wanted to use like the pure versions of drugs?
Well, firstly, they believed that the drugs that regular doctors used too often were not even pure, right? They thought they were pure and they weren't even pure. But they also believed that if you really wanted to understand how a drug works, then you needed to be sure that the drug you were working with was pure. Because how could you be sure that whatever effects that it was having were the results of that particular drug rather than the mixture? So it was partly experimental, right? It was partly the notion that if you want to test something, it's sort of like you don't go into a chemistry lab and they give you a beaker full of 5 things, right? And say, well, how does it work, right? They give you one thing, right? And then you add things to it or not, right? And so the idea is that you look for, but they also believed in purity. They believed that single drugs were generally more effective and clear. And that one of the problems with regular medicine is they just threw together a bunch of drugs and said, oh, I'm sure this one will be fine. Or sometimes if something wasn't working, they would just add another one. You know, and which is, you know, sadly true. That's true. So there is that sense, and also homeopathy believes that, as I'm sure you've read, that the smaller the dose, the stronger. So that firstly you need purity, right, before you can start to talk about if I make this a smaller dose, will it still have the same effect? If I make it an even smaller dose, will it have the same effect? Right? Yeah.
I guess especially if there are like trace elements or something in then homeopathic would say that that's the thing that'll be stressed. So yeah, it makes perfect sense. So I guess, do you think that homeopathic movements have had like a resurgence recently, or have they like always been happening and people are just invoking them more, or is that not even the case?
They definitely were invoked in the 60s and 70s. There was this sort of naturopath, homeopathic sort of sub-movement with the counterculture and New Age, right? And I've read some in that period, and what you see is a number of older homeopathic physicians who were really frustrated by what they thought were ignorant kids who kept saying, oh, this is the coolest thing, and it reminds me of the Native Americans. Like maybe there's something that goes through all of our drugs that help to make our bodies well. And they would think, oh my God, you know. So there were many strains, let us say, right? There was a countercultural strain. There were a continuing small number of people who studied homeopathy, often after they did an MD, right? And you could do post-grad training courses in some places. And then they traveled to places where homeopathic doctors were widely used, like India, right? Like just, they're widely used in India today, you know. So you could always find places where homeopathy hadn't disappeared and feel that some people valued what you were doing. But I think that also homeopathy was taken up as an example of an anti-establishment, holistic movement, and gets integrated into groups where 100 years ago they would never have seen eye to eye, like anti-vaxxers, right? So you have anti-vaxxers who see themselves as using homeopathy among other sort of like non-establishment drugs, right? And this is where it just becomes enormously, I don't want to say confusing, because you can see where that comes from, right? But what that means is that homeopathy has a very different meaning for these people, right? It means anti-everything orthodox, right? It means anti-doctor, right? And while it's true that homeopathy in the 19th century was anti-regular doctor, they weren't anti-doctors. And most homeopaths, Hahnemann wrote in German, and many homeopaths in America were of German lineage. And the reason I'm mentioning that is a German physician was a very sort of respectable, uptight person, right? The opposite of a hippie, if you see what I mean, from a 19th century point of view. So, the way that doctors practiced was incredibly respectable and, just not Gwyneth Paltrow at all, right? But I think that elements of homeopathy have been taken up by other people. And, homeopathy has a lot in it, like many systems, like orthodox medicine. And you can pick and choose the stuff that you think works for your kind of mindset, which is why the counterculture really loved it, right? They didn't read Hahnemann's books or anything. That was irrelevant to them, right? But they really liked the idea of pure drugs. I mean, we all like the idea of pure drugs, right? And everyone likes the idea of the smaller the better. I don't mean that therefore the smaller the better always works, but the notion that people were being overdrugged, that's a true thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's lots and lots of sort of political, cultural ways of integrating homeopathy that make sense for people.
That's really interesting to me, because I had so much trouble reconciling this image of homeopathy I saw in your article that's just like so like organized, like they had like real hospitals.
They had real hospitals.
Yeah, like
they had real medical schools.
Who knew?
They had real medical schools where you learn real medicine, right? This is not a, airy-fairy anti-doctor kind of thing. There were always people in the 19th century and other places who were anti-doctor. I don't want to suggest that they weren't, but homeopaths were not one of them, right? Not in the 19th century, not in the early 20th century, no. There were licensing boards and examining boards run by homeopaths. I'm sorry, I don't think you can get more establishment than that, really, and they would give exams and tell you if you were fit to practice as a properly qualified homeopath or not. I call that establishment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that the missing link between my conception of homeopathy that I've had versus the one that I'm now understanding was the case not too long ago is the New Age counterculture movement.
I think so. Yeah.
So do you think that was a misidentification by the counterculture movement and that their interests weren't as aligned? Or
I think they were able to identify elements of homeopathy which had always been somewhat ambiguous, right? If you're anti-regular medicine, does that mean you're kind of anti-medicine? Like, is there a little anti-medicine in there or something? And they were able to pull out elements of homeopathy that I think exist in homeopathy, and make them bigger and make them the more central elements that worked for them. Especially because that was a moment when there were a lot of people who wanted to be healers or providers, or whatever the word would have been. Practitioners probably would have been the word in the 70s. But what they wanted to be eclectics, is what you call them in the 19th century. They wanted to pick pieces of the best systems, ideally not orthodox medicine at all. And they would do like a 6 months in naturopathy, and they would like study homeopathy, and they would go to India, right, and study Ayurvedic medicine, and they would go to New Mexico and try to learn something about Native American healing. And do you see what I'm saying here? It's sort of like, and that was very appealing to a New Age point of view, right? If it's a New Age, then maybe what you need is sort of New Age medicine, and homeopathy fit into that.
No, yeah. I mean, I know my own mom, she had Lyme disease and was very distraught with how modern medicine could deal with something like that. And she's a doctor herself, so she knows, like,
right,
the ways of the medical world.
Oh, yeah.
And she still would buy books on like homeopathic natural remedies, like do all kinds of research on natural remedies, because when mainstream medicine you feel is failing you, like what else do you do? And
Right.
I think that even if it didn't help her like physically, it certainly helped her mentally.
And
It,
who's to say that it didn't help her physically?
yeah, I don't know.
I
But
know. I
even if it
mean,
did not, it had a
yes.
benefit. Yeah.
Yeah. hmm In fact, homeopathy is one of a number of alternative medical systems that benefit a lot with all the things that regular medicine is bad at.
Mm,
You know, osteopathy and chiropractic, right? Um, uh, regular medicine is really pretty bad at spines and bad backs, right? They're
yeah.
not very good. And so, you get, as it were, back specialists who believe something slightly different, though they osteopaths are trained as DOs, which is like an MD for osteopathy. And they concentrate in parts of the body that they claim they do better. There were always patients who, for example, had certain kinds of cancer, and they didn't want to hear that somebody said to them, there's nothing we can do. And when they heard that, what they heard is, there's nothing that we, Orthodox trained doctors, can do. But how do you know what other people can do? And so there's always been that search for other systems that maybe understand the body better, differently, can heal it in ways that other people can't. There's a lot of discussion in the mainstream medical literature about the ways that people are healed that you can't explain traditionally in Orthodox ways. And at a certain point, let me just say, the word placebo stops to mean anything. It stops meaning
Absolutely.
anything.
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
really,
true.
really, the sky is blue. Placebo. I mean, really, so it's a very interesting conversation to watch trained Orthodox professionals dealing with cases of people being healed. I mean, I look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg and I just think to myself, oh my God. I mean, she has just beaten back the kinds of things that I'm sure various physicians would have said, well, your life is over, you should probably quit now. No? And it's very impressive.
Yeah. I I agree that the conversation of what even is a placebo is a really interesting one to have to a certain, I mean, just the prevalence of sugar pills like on the market and how like there are a lot of studies that show that like for certain things they can have actual effects
Mhm.
is completely fascinating to me, for good reason, I think. And I also think that like this idea of if something is called untreatable by regular medicine, then seek alternative solutions is something that's part of our like collective consciousness in a sense. Like there's so many movies where the star is told that they're not going to live and they go and explore Eastern medicine or whatever the equivalent is in that movie or whatever.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Mhm. Yes. Now, it is true, and I just want to, add this, that very often Orthodox commentators will say these are just desperate people,
mm,
right? They're desperate. They have no idea what they're doing. They find unscrupulous providers who fleece them and tell them, you just need to bow to the sun or whatever. And occasionally they get well, and they attribute that to whatever this system was, but that just shows how um, uh, misguided they were, probably as a result of their medical condition. Yeah.
yeah,
So there is a lack of belief, and you see this when you listen to people talking about homeopathy and naturopathy and so on. There's a lack of belief often in regular medicine that the people who use it and value it are actually kind of sane, but
mm,
maybe they're a little,
yeah,
maybe they're a little crazy. And of course, this is such an effective argument to explain why someone would get better or worse, or not even know, right? A combination of being a little crazy and a little ignorant. Um, and, um, and this is actually what makes studying alternative medicine, which is one of my areas of interest, really interesting. Because if you truly put that aside, then you have some very hard questions to ask.
Mm. So I would say that the positive of homeopathy, from my perspective, is the ability for it to be somewhere to face when mainstream medicine fails you, and in some like a safety net of sorts, for at the very least your mental state. And I think that that is significantly less insidious than what I see as people invoking homeopathy to say like, oh, well, I don't need to wear a face mask, I don't need vaccinations because mainstream medicine is just lying to me. So why would I mildly inconvenience myself?
You did read about the minister at the Texas church where the high school kids had a rally for Trump, who said that there was a special atomizer that his church had invested in. And the reason that nobody needed to wear masks or social distance is that that special atomizer was zapping the virus. And I thought, wait, tell us more. But yeah, so this is another very interesting conversation, which is, you know, what is it that these other kinds of medicines do? And in the 90s, the NIH decided to fund a sort of institute, like a mini institute, in alternative medicine. And in order to make sure that, and some people were appalled by that, in order to make sure that people didn't think that they thought that it was valuable, that it was alternative, they called it complementary. And so for a while, for like a couple of years, people used to use the word complementary, right? So you could do it at the same time, or, you know, to cover something else that, you know, as long as you, of course, told your regular physician what you were doing so that there were no counter indications or whatever. And it even assumed that it would be complementary, which is often not the case. Right? It's not true that all alternative medicine fits well
Yeah,
with,
absolutely not.
I mean, but they really didn't want the word alternative.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like it's hard to detox while taking medication. Like, what are
Right.
you gonna do?
That's right.
Hmm. No, yeah. So,
Give me just another question, because I
yeah,
yeah.
I'm thinking about how
Okay.
I want to phrase this. So, I guess, do you think that homeopathy is being used as a justification for harmful acts more or less than is being used for like people that legitimately want something that they can turn to or something that they can hope for or some other form of treatment rather than a justification for a lack of treatment that puts other people in danger?
I think that homeopathy is able to be weaponized, and it does get weaponized, definitely. I think it benefits because it sounds kind of fuzzy and amorphous. I mean,
Mm.
could anything really be homeopathy if you don't really know what it is? You know, could be
Mm-hmm.
ors, right? I don't know. Maybe that, you know, it isn't, but I'm just saying it could be any of those things. And so that makes it perhaps a bit easier to weaponize, because you just, in a way, you're using the word homeopathy to really mean lots of different alternative medical ideas and practices that you're claiming give you health to the level that you don't need to follow other guidelines.
Mm.
And I just have to say that I have never heard of a homeopathic drug, for example, that ever was supposed to protect yourself from an infectious disease, like a mask is supposed to do. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, these claims are imposed, but homeopathy, because of its sort of ambiguity, it works well. You can do it very effectively.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So I guess I was it seems I've been picking the wrong fight against I mean, it's not like I've been protesting homeopathy, but like
No. But you've been taking on the way that
yeah.
homeopathy is presented as part of an anti-vaxxer, an anti-whatever, and it is used that way. I mean, it's absolutely true. It's just not actually what homeopathy was in the past, or even there are a whole bunch of elements of homeopathy that it doesn't encompass today, but it's certainly the most well-known notion of homeopathy is what you hear.
And it also certainly seems very likely that if homeopathy were not a thing, people would be finding some other way to justify not following guidelines. So so I guess it does not make sense to blame homeopathy as like a practice itself, which is interesting.
Right.
I'm glad I'm aware.
Right. Which I just want to say more generally is often the case. Right. People call on something and say, this is why I believe this. All right. It's because I think that this is helping me or protecting me or whatever. And, really question one should be, what is it that they're calling on, before you look at how they're calling on it?
Yeah. It's a convenient justification rather than a...
Yeah. But I mean, some of them work better than others. And I think homeopathy works well. And that's an interesting question. Like, what is it about it that works well? No. You don't hear people say, I believe in chiropractic, so I don't need to wear masks.
Yeah, I was going to bring up chiropractic.
Not all alternative systems work that way, right? Some do, and some in a way have a clear place in modern American life. So you can't quite pull them out the way you could something like homeopathy. People know what chiropractic is. They know how it works, and they know who does it and where and so on. And so you can't mystify it as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's something inherently about homeopathy, which is like, even if it were a more established field, which it seems like it used to be, just the very definition of being not mainstream medicine means that it's a very good excuse not to do mainstream medicine.
It's great. Yeah, very true. All right. So thank you so much. Good luck. If you have a couple of other questions, you can always just email me. Okay. All right. And good luck in Maine. Sounds fantastic.
Thank you so much for the interview. This is actually my first time interviewing someone, so I appreciate the opportunity.
You did a good job.
Nice. Excellent.